Wildflowers still bent the same way in the wind the Friday her husband died, and Adeline Boone was still riding into Abilene to buy them for him 11 years later, though no one in the whole county knew why, until the day the question finally came. She rode in on the same chestnut mare, tied up at the same rail, and walked into the same little flower shop on Cattleman's Row, and the whole town had learned, over more than a decade of Fridays, not to press a woman like her for a question she hadn't chosen to answer. "I want you to stay for the whole ride tonight, the ranch and the wedding and the grave beneath the oak, because a devotion that quiet doesn't announce itself all at once. It earns you a little at a time, the way good land earns a rancher's trust." When his young wife Alice died in February of 1884, the very year this story opens, Theodore Roosevelt wrote a single line in his diary and then never uttered her name aloud again for the rest of his life. "The light has gone out of my life," he wrote, and then he rode west into the Dakota Badlands to grieve where the country was too big and too indifferent to argue back. Adeline Boone never had a Badlands to disappear into. She had a ranch to run, a county that watched her, and a Friday, and a promise she had made a dying man that she intended to keep for as long as her own heart kept beating. So let's ride back to where it started, out along the Smoky Hill River in the spring before any of it, when Adeline Boone was still a girl, learning to sit a horse the way her father sat one, easy and sure, like the animal owed her nothing, and she'd earned it anyway. Adeline had grown up on Larkspur, the modest spread her father carved out of the Kansas grassland the year the railroad first cut through Dickinson County, and she had been running cattle alongside him since she was tall enough to see over a saddle horn. She was 22 in the spring of 1872, dark-haired and sun-browned, strong through the shoulders, in the way that came from years of real work rather than the kind that got mentioned in church, and she could read weather off a horizon the way other women read a letter. She had turned down 2 suitors already by then, gently but without apology, men who admired the acreage more openly than they admired the woman who ran it, and she had decided, privately, that she would rather grow old alone on good land than young and lonesome on someone else's terms. Amos Whitfield came into that arrangement sideways, the way most important things do. He was a horsebreaker 3 ranches over, 26 years old, quiet in the particular way of a man who had done more listening than talking his whole life, with pale eyes that missed very little and a gentleness with green horses that half the county came to borrow when their own stock turned ornery. He had no family left in Kansas, a brother somewhere in the Dakota Territory he wrote to twice a year, and a reputation for finishing what he started without ever making noise about having started it. Adeline first saw him gentling a wild-caught bay gelding in the Larkspur corral on a Tuesday in April, her father having sent for him after the animal put a ranch hand through a fence rail, and she stood at the top rail for the better part of an hour, watching a stranger talk a frightened animal down to something like trust, using nothing louder than his own voice, and the patience of a man with nowhere else he needed to be. He noticed her watching on the 3rd day, and instead of performing for her the way some men might have, he simply wondered aloud whether she wanted to try leading the gelding herself, now that it would stand for a rope. She did. It went well, mostly because Amos had done the hard part already, and knew exactly how much slack a green animal needed from a stranger's hand. But Adeline found she liked working alongside a man who explained what he was doing, rather than a man who expected to be admired for doing it. They talked, over the following weeks, about horses and weather, and the particular stubbornness of Kansas soil, and Adeline discovered that Amos Whitfield, for all his quiet, had opinions about nearly everything, and gave them plainly once he trusted you enough to ask. He came back to Larkspur most weeks that summer, first for the horses and later, plainly, for her, and by August he had planted a row of wild prairie roses along the fence line nearest the house, without anyone requesting it, working 2 evenings after his own chores were done, because the land, he believed, ought to have to work for something beautiful once in a while, and not just for cattle and cash crops. Adeline stood in the yard watching him set the last of the bare root canes into the ground, dirt to his elbows, and put it to him plainly. A man didn't plant roses for a ranch he had no stake in. Amos straightened, considered that a moment the way he considered most things, and made it just as plain that he intended to have a stake in it if she'd have him. She had him. They married that October in the front room of the county parson's house, with her father standing witness and weeping without any shame about it, and Amos moved his few belongings and his good gelding out to Larkspur the following week. And that, more or less, was the whole of their courtship. Plain and unhurried and entirely sufficient for two people who had already decided what they wanted. Their life together at Larkspur ran ordinary and good for the better part of 2 years. The kind of good that doesn't make for much storytelling at the time, and becomes precious only afterward, once a person understands how little of it any of us actually get. Amos worked the horses and helped Adeline run the cattle, and between the two of them the ranch prospered in a modest, steady way that never made either of them rich but made them entirely comfortable, which they both agreed was worth a great deal more. Every Friday when Amos rode into Abilene to sell a string of horses or settle accounts at the bank, he brought Adeline back something small from town, a length of ribbon, a paper of pins, and always, without fail, a bundle of whatever flowers the season allowed. White lilies when they could be had, wild prairie roses when they couldn't, tied with plain twine, because he never once in his life learned to tie a proper bow. Adeline used to tell him he was wasting good money on flowers that would wilt inside a week, and Amos used to answer, every time, that the wilting was rather the point, that a thing worth having again next Friday was worth more than a thing that lasted and stopped meaning anything. She kept every one of those Friday bouquets in a chipped blue pitcher on the kitchen windowsill, replacing the old with the new each week, without ever quite noticing she'd built herself a ritual, and it was there, at that windowsill, 2 years into their marriage, that Amos first mentioned the ache that would eventually take him. He named it nothing more than a tiredness that wouldn't shake loose, the kind a hard winter left behind, and Adeline believed him for a while, because there was no particular reason not to, and because Amos Whitfield was not a man given to complaining about small things. But the tiredness didn't lift with spring the way ordinary tiredness does, and by early summer the fever had settled into him properly, the kind that came and went in waves and left him gray and hollow-eyed between spells, the kind the county doctor, when he finally rode out to look at him, put a Latin name to, one that meant, stripped of its dignity, that there was very little left to be done. Adeline nursed him through that summer, with the same steadiness she brought to everything else in her life, sitting up through the worst of his fevers, with cool cloths and quiet talk, refusing every suggestion from well-meaning neighbors that she ought to send him somewhere else to be cared for, because Larkspur was his home as much as hers by then, and she intended for him to stay in it. Amos, for his part, spent the clearer days of that summer doing what he could still manage, mending what fence he had strength for, teaching Adeline the last few things about the horses he thought she ought to know, and talking with her, in the evenings when the fever eased, about what the ranch would need from her once he was no longer there to help carry it. He never once pretended the ending wasn't coming. He was too plain a man for that kind of comfortable lying, and Adeline, though it broke something in her each time he said it aloud, found she was grateful for the honesty, even as she hated the truth of it. It was on one of the better evenings in September, with the worst of the day's fever past and the window open to a cooling breeze off the river, that Amos drew her down to sit with him a while longer before she banked the fire, and laid out, in the plain, unhurried way, he laid out everything that mattered, what he wanted her to promise. He didn't want her wearing black for the rest of her life, like a woman performing grief for the county's benefit. And he didn't want the ranch to go to seed out of sentiment, and most of all, taking her hand in both of his. He didn't want her letting her own heart go as empty and closed off as the prairie ran in the dead of winter, all that good open land with nothing growing in it. He wanted her to keep living, plainly, fully, the way she'd always lived, and to let herself want things again whenever wanting came back to her. Adeline could not promise him that, not honestly, not that night with his hand still warm in hers. What she could promise was that she would never let a single Friday pass without bringing him something beautiful, the way he'd brought her something beautiful nearly every Friday of their marriage, so that whatever else happened to her heart, that particular door would never close. Amos considered that for a long moment, and let it stand at that. That would do just fine. And it was the last full conversation of any real length the two of them ever had, because the fever came back hard 3 days later and didn't ease again. Amos Whitfield died on the second Friday of October in 1874, with Adeline holding his hand and the last of the season's wild roses standing in the chipped blue pitcher on the windowsill, exactly where they'd always stood. She buried him herself, with the help of 2 hired hands and the parson who'd married them, beneath a broad oak on a rise overlooking the river, a spot Amos had once pointed out to her on a ride together as the prettiest piece of ground on the whole ranch, and she had a plain wooden marker cut with his name and the years of his life and nothing else, because Amos had never cared for more words than a thing required. She was 24 years old, a widow, and the sole owner of a working cattle ranch in a county that had not yet decided what to make of a woman running one alone. What the county learned over the following 11 years, slowly and against most of its early expectations, was that Adeline Boone did not need deciding about. She ran Larkspur herself, hired good hands and paid them fairly, expanded the herd twice over, and built a reputation as sharp a rancher as any man working that stretch of the Smoky Hill, all without remarrying, without complaint, and without ever once explaining herself to anyone who wondered why. And every single Friday, without exception, rain or dust or the hardest winter weather Dickinson County could produce, she rode the 8 miles into Abilene, saw to her business at the bank and the mercantile, and walked into the flower shop on Cattleman's Row to buy the same bundle Amos used to bring her, white lilies mixed with wild prairie roses, when the season allowed either one, tied with plain twine, because she'd never learned a proper bow any better than he had. The shop belonged to a widow named Eleanor Voss, a soft-spoken woman who had come to Abilene from Ohio the same year Adeline was married and had watched the ritual unfold, Friday by Friday, for longer than either of them had bothered to count. Eleanor never pried. She had buried a husband of her own to the influenza 6 years back, and understood, in the particular way that grief teaches a person to understand another grieving person, that some rituals belong entirely to the one performing them and ought to be left that way. She simply made certain, every week, that the freshest lilies and the brightest roses she could find were set aside before Adeline arrived, and she never once charged full price, though Adeline, being Adeline, always tried to pay it anyway. It was Eleanor's niece, a young woman named Josephine Hale, who had come out from Topeka the previous spring to help mind the shop, who finally worked up the nerve to ask the question the whole county had been carrying around unspoken for the better part of a decade. Josephine had heard the talk, the way anyone working the counter of a small-town shop hears every rumor Abilene had ever produced. Some folks swore Adeline Boone kept a sweetheart on a ranch too far off to be seen in daylight. Others speculated about a child given up for adoption long ago, or a sister nobody in town had ever met, or simply an old woman's harmless eccentricity, since a widow was permitted her strangeness once she'd earned enough years of respectability to cover it. Nobody, in 11 years of Fridays, had managed to actually ask her, mostly because there was something in the settled quiet of Adeline Boone's manner that discouraged the asking, the way a closed gate discourages a rider from trying it uninvited. Josephine was 20 years old that autumn and had not yet learned the particular caution that kept the rest of the town's tongues still around her aunt's most faithful customer. She wrapped the lilies and roses in their usual brown paper, tied the twine the way Eleanor had taught her, and, handing the bundle across the counter, wondered aloud, as gently as she knew how, whether she might ask who they were for. Adeline went still with the bouquet halfway into her hands, and for a moment the shop was quiet enough that the wagons rolling past on Cattleman's Row seemed to fade into some other, farther country. Then something eased in her face, not sorrow exactly, or not only sorrow, and she let the girl know that nobody had raised that question in 11 years, and that she supposed it was about time somebody had. "They're for my husband," came the plain answer. "Amos. He's been gone 11 years this October." Josephine's face flushed with the particular horror of a young person who fears she's trespassed somewhere private, and she began to apologize, but Adeline waved it off gently, letting her know there was nothing to apologize for, that a question put plainly deserved a plain answer, and that if Josephine had an hour to spare and didn't mind the ride, she'd show her the rest of it rather than try to explain it standing at a shop counter. Josephine, curious in the way only the young and unguarded can afford to be, agreed before she'd fully thought it through, and within the half hour, The two of them were riding out along the river road toward Larkspur, the bouquet wrapped carefully across Adeline's saddle. They rode past the ranch house itself and on toward the rise above the river, where the broad oak stood exactly as it had for longer than either of them had been alive, its shade falling long and cool across the grass, even in the last of the autumn heat. Beneath it stood the plain wooden marker, weathered gray now, but still legibly cut, Amos Whitfield's name and the years of a life that had run only 30. Adeline dismounted without a word and knelt beside the grave, the way a person kneels, who has done the same motion 1,000 times before, and laid the lilies and the wild roses across the grass, with the same careful, unhurried hands she used for nearly everything. Standing there, Adeline finally gave the girl the whole of it, plain and unhurried the way she gave most things. He planted roses for me along the fence line, the summer we were courting, because he said the land ought to have to work for something beautiful once in a while. Every Friday of our marriage, when he rode to town, he brought me flowers home, whatever the season would give him, tied with twine because the man never in his life learned to tie a decent bow. When he was dying, he made me promise I'd keep something alive in myself, not letting my heart run as empty as the prairie in winter. And the only honest promise I could give him back was that I'd never let a Friday pass without something beautiful crossing between us, one direction or the other. He gave them to me for 2 years. I've been giving them back to him for 11, and I expect I'll go on giving them for as long as I'm able to sit a horse. Josephine had grown up believing, in the vague, unexamined way most young people believe things, that flowers were meant for the living, gifts exchanged between people who could still see each other's faces and hear each other's voices across a room. Standing on that rise with the river running quiet below and the shadow of the oak moving slow across a widow's bowed shoulders, she understood, for what felt like the first time in her young life, that devotion didn't actually require an audience to still be real. I come out here most Fridays and tell him what the week held, Adeline went on, still kneeling, her voice steady in the particular way of a person who has made peace with a thing without ever once stopping loving it. The calves that came early, the fences that needed mending, a neighbor's wedding, whatever's passed since the last time I sat here. A promise isn't meant to end just because the person you made it to is gone. If anything, it's meant to matter more once there's no one left to hold you to it but yourself. Adeline finished, straightening at last and brushing the dirt from her knees. Josephine rode back into Abilene that evening, with more to think about than she'd carried out, and though she kept the particulars of what she'd seen to herself, out of a respect for Adeline that had grown considerably in the space of a single afternoon, something in her manner toward the ranchwoman changed from that Friday forward, visible to anyone who cared to notice. She began setting aside the finest lilies in the shop, before Adeline's usual hour, hunting down wild roses from farther afield, once the local stock thinned toward the season's end, and she stopped, entirely, trying to charge full price, no matter how firmly Adeline pressed the point. Eleanor noticed the shift in her niece without prying into its cause, guessing correctly, in the quiet way of women who have buried husbands of their own, exactly what had passed between the two of them out along the river road. The years that followed ran much as the years before had, which is to say quietly, steadily, and without much drama beyond the ordinary business of running a good ranch through good seasons and bad ones. Larkspur prospered under Adeline's hand. Her herds grew, and the county that had once wondered what to make of an unmarried woman running cattle alone had long since stopped wondering and started simply respecting her, the way any place eventually respects a person who has proven, year after year, that they are exactly as capable as their work suggests. She never remarried, though it was not for lack of men willing to try, over the years, to convince her that a ranch that size wanted a man's hand on it. She turned each of them down, the same way she'd turned down suitors at 22, gently, without apology, and with a clarity about her own life that none of them ever quite managed to argue with. She had made a promise once, to a man who had wanted nothing more from her than that she go on living fully, and she had found, in her own quiet way, that she was living fully already, on her own land, on her own terms, with a Friday ritual that required nothing of anyone but her own 2 hands and a horse steady enough to carry her. Josephine married a young rancher from the county's north end, 3 years after that first ride out to the oak, and stayed on helping her aunt at the shop through every season of her own growing family. And it became, in time, an understood and unremarked thing between the three women, Eleanor, Josephine, and Adeline, that the Friday bouquet was never to be rushed, never shorted, and never, under any circumstance, forgotten to be set aside. Younger clerks who came through the shop over the years got the same instruction without much explanation attached, that the widow from Larkspur got the finest of whatever was blooming that week, no questions, no exceptions, and most of them simply accepted it as one of the shop's small permanent customs. The way every long-running business accumulates a few rules nobody remembers arguing into existence. Adeline Boone kept her Friday ride for 11 more years past the afternoon she first let Josephine in on the truth of it, through every season Dickinson County gave her, until she was 61 years old and had outlived nearly every rancher who'd known Larkspur in its earliest days. Her hair had long since gone entirely silver, her hands had grown stiff with the particular ache that decades of rope and rain leave behind, but she had never once, in 22 years of Fridays, missed her ride into town, and the shop, by then run mostly by Josephine with Eleanor, long retired to a chair by the window, had never once failed to have her bouquet ready. It was a Friday in early spring, when Adeline's chestnut mare, gray-muzzled herself by then and nearly as old as the ritual it carried, came walking into Abilene alone, reins trailing loose, and stopped, as it had stopped every week for over 2 decades, at the same rail outside the same shop, and simply waited there the way it always had, except that this time no rider climbed down from its back. Josephine saw the empty saddle from the shop window and understood, before anyone rode out to Larkspur to confirm it, exactly what the sight meant, because a horse that faithful to a route doesn't wander that route out of confusion. Adeline had gone out early that morning, her hired foreman recalled later, same as always, meaning simply to check the north fence line before her ride into town, and her heart, worn as gently and as thoroughly as everything else about her by that point, had simply stopped somewhere along the way, on land she had run herself for 37 years. They found her not far from the fence line, in sight of the river, and word reached Josephine by midday. She closed the shop, gathered the finest bouquet she could assemble on short notice, lilies and wild prairie roses both in full bloom that week, as though the season itself had known to cooperate, and rode out to Larkspur herself rather than wait for anyone else to carry the flowers. The county buried Adeline Boone beside her husband beneath the broad oak on the rise above the river, the two graves resting side by side at last after 37 years of one visiting the other alone, and it was Josephine, kneeling in the same spot she'd stood respectfully apart from as a girl of 20, who laid the final bouquet across the fresh grass and gave voice to words that would be echoed in Abilene for years afterward, though she never claimed to have planned them ahead of time. She isn't waiting alone anymore. Josephine found, to her own surprise, that she believed every word of it. From that Friday forward, someone from the town rode out to the oak above the river with fresh flowers, not every single week at first, but often enough, and then more often, until it settled, the way good customs do, into something nobody quite remembers deciding to start. Josephine's own daughter took up the habit eventually, and after her a granddaughter, and the ranch itself passed through careful hands that kept the fence lines mended and the roses along the old porch trimmed back each spring the way Amos had first planted them. Because a place tended that long by that much devotion tends to keep finding people willing to go on tending it. The shop on Cattleman's Row still stands, changed hands a dozen times over the generations, but the story of the rancher and her Friday flowers is one every owner has learned when they took over the register, the way a place passes down the customs that made it what it is. I think about Theodore Roosevelt sometimes when I tell this story, a man who rode west to grieve where the land was too vast to argue back, and I think about Adeline Boone, who didn't need a Badlands at all, because she found, right there on her own Kansas ground, a way to keep loving a man the fever had taken from her without ever once needing him back in the room to do it. The light didn't go out of her life the way it went out of Roosevelt's, not permanently, not the way he feared it might for himself. She simply carried it differently, out along a river road every Friday for 37 years, one bundle of lilies and wild roses at a time, until the carrying itself became a kind of second, quieter marriage, every bit as real as the first one had been, and every bit as faithfully kept. That's where I'll leave Adeline and Amos Whitfield, together now beneath the oak on the rise, with the roses he planted still blooming along an old fence line, and a town that never did stop bringing flowers to two people who taught them, without ever meaning to, what a promise is actually worth. If you rode this whole trail with me tonight, thank you for staying for every mile of it, the courting and the roses and the grave and the years after, the way I invited you to at the very start. This is Cowgirl Chronicles, and we tell the stories of women who ran their own land, kept their own promises, and loved, in the end, exactly as hard and as long as they ever promised they would. Come sit by the fire again next time. I'll leave the gate open for you, and the flowers will still be there,